I had been at Fort Halcott 11 months the morning Master Sergeant Cade Bishop struck a woman I did not yet know. And I want to be honest about the man I was when it happened, because the man I was would have told you Bishop was right. The combative schoolhouse sat at the far northeast corner of the post, past the motor pool and the old rail spur, in a long tan building that had once been an aircraft maintenance bay. Inside, the ceilings went up 40 feet to a lattice of steel trusses and caged sodium lamps, and the floor was one great continuous field of blue and gray mats, 400 of them zipped edge to edge, so clean you could see the fluorescent tubes reflected in them like a second sky laid down under your boots. The whole place smelled of chalk and canvas, and the particular sourness of men working hard in a closed room. I loved it the way you love a thing that has taken you in. I had come to Halcott a soft kid from a soft town, and the mats had made me into something harder, and the man who ran the mats was Cade Bishop. He was 44 years old that spring and built like a door, not tall, but wide through the chest and thick in the forearms, with a shaved skull gone gray at the stubble, and a nose that had been broken so many times it no longer pointed anywhere in particular. He had 2 combat tour behind him, and a wall of certificates behind his desk, and he moved across the mats with the flat, unhurried certainty of a man who has never once, in his adult life, lost a fight he cared about winning. When Bishop demonstrated a technique, 30 grown soldiers went silent. When Bishop put his hand on your shoulder and said good, you carried it home for a week. I was his senior assistant instructor, a corporal with 2 years on the mats and a head full of everything he had poured into it, and I would have followed him into a burning building if he'd told me the fire was instructional. That is the thing I need you to understand before I tell you the rest. I did not stand in that room and watch a bully I already despised. I watched a man I admired more than my own father, and I agreed with him, and when it was over, I had to build myself back up from the studs, because the whole frame of me had been resting on his judgment, and his judgment turned out to be rotten in the one place it mattered most. The morning it happened was a Tuesday in the second week of an advanced course, the Level 4 cycle, the hardest we ran, 40 seats for senior non-commissioned officers and a handful of officers looking to earn the master badge and take the doctrine back to their own units. These were not beginners. These were sergeants first class and master sergeants and one lean captain with a ranger tab, men who had already broken other men, and they came to Halcott to be broken and rebuilt at a higher grade. Bishop lived for that cycle. It was where his reputation renewed itself. The Level 4 soldiers arrived thinking they were hard, and Bishop spent 3 weeks teaching them the exact dimensions of how much harder the ceiling went, and they left worshiping him, and the worship traveled with them across the whole army. That was the engine of the man. He needed the room to know he was the hardest thing in it, and for 11 months I had never seen the room decide otherwise. We had a new name on the roster that Tuesday, a late ad, a transfer from another installation, slotted in after the cycle had already begun, which never happened and which put Bishop in a temper before the doors even opened. He hated a broken sequence. He read the name off the clipboard twice, frowning, and I remember he said it out loud to me in the equipment cage while we laid out the crash pads. Sergeant Vale. He said it the way you'd say a wrong answer. No first name filled in, no unit history, just a rank 1 notch below his own and a last name, and a training record that the transferring post had marked, in the box for prior combatives' experience, with a single word: extensive. Extensive, Bishop said, and let the clipboard fall against his thigh. They all write extensive. Then they get on my mats and I find out extensive means they watched a video. He looked at me and I gave him the grin he wanted because I wanted the grin back, and he clapped me on the shoulder and we went out to meet the cycle. I saw her before he did. She was already on the mats when we came out of the cage, sitting cross-legged near the back wall in the standard training uniform, gray tee, canvas trousers, no rank, no name tape, nothing to mark her out, because on the mats we stripped all of that off and everyone was just a body learning to control another body. She was small. That was the first thing, and I am ashamed of how much weight I gave it. Small and lean and somewhere past 40. With short dark hair going iron at the temples and a stillness to the way, she sat that I read, that morning, as timidity. She had her hands loose on her knees, and she was watching the room fill up with these enormous hard men. And she did not look nervous exactly, but she looked apart, and I decided in about 4 seconds that she was a mistake the personnel system had made. A small, older woman who had tested into a room she could not survive, and that Bishop was going to spend 3 weeks regretting the broken sequence. I want to stop here and tell you what I did not see, because I have gone over that morning 10,000 times since, and the signs were all there for a man with the eyes to read them, and I did not have the eyes. I did not see the way she was watching. I thought she was looking at the men. She was not looking at the men. She was looking at how they moved, at the captain with the ranger tab rolling his neck, at the big master sergeant from the armor unit shifting his weight foot to foot, at the way one man favored a knee and another carried his hands too low. She was reading the room the way Bishop read it, the way I was only beginning to learn to read it, except she was doing it without a flicker of effort, the way you'd read the time off a clock, and the stillness I mistook for timidity was the stillness of a person who has already cataloged every threat in a space and found none of them worth standing up for. I have watched enough of her since to know that now. That morning I saw a small, tired woman against a wall, and I felt something close to pity, and the pity was the most arrogant thing in the entire building, and it was mine. Bishop opened the day the way he always did, walking the center line of the mats with his hands behind his back, letting the silence build. 40 of the hardest soldiers in the army sat along the walls and watched him and waited. He gave them the speech, that the badge on the wall meant nothing here, that rank meant nothing here, that the only currency on his mats was what you could do to the person in front of you and what you could keep them from doing to you. He was good at it. He was very good at it. And then, the way he always did, he found the biggest man in the room to make his first point on, because Bishop's whole doctrine of teaching was that if he could control the largest body in the space, every smaller body would believe. That Tuesday the biggest man was the armor master sergeant, a genuine mountain named Pruitt, 6'4" and 260 pounds, and Bishop called him to the center and let him try, at full resistance, to put Bishop on the ground. Pruitt could not. Of course he could not. Bishop slipped him and off-balanced him and folded that mountain onto the mats 3 times in 90 seconds, gently, almost lovingly, narrating each one, and the room made the low sound a room makes when it decides to believe. I made the sound too. I always made the sound. And then Bishop, warm now, riding the room's belief, turned and found the small woman against the back wall, and I felt my stomach drop because I knew exactly what he was going to do, and part of me, the worst part, the part he had built, was glad. He didn't call her out at first. That would have been too quick for Bishop. He liked to build the moment. He walked the line and talked about how the techniques we taught were not about size, how a smaller soldier could control a larger one, how that was the whole promise of the doctrine. And while he said it, he drifted toward the back wall, and the room understood before she did that she was going to be the demonstration. The small woman, the living proof of the small defeat's large sermon. It was a natural piece of theater, and Bishop reached for it the way he reached for everything, without doubt. "You," he said, "Sergeant Vale, up." She stood. She did it without hurry, unfolding from the mat in one clean motion that used no hands, and I noticed that and dismissed it, the way I dismissed everything that morning. She walked to the center line and stood in front of him. And the top of her head came to somewhere around his collarbone, and the room got very quiet and very interested, because everyone loves to watch the schoolmaster make a point on the smallest kid. "Sergeant Vale here transferred in with a record that says extensive," Bishop told the room, and there was a laugh in his voice, the generous laugh of a man inviting everyone to enjoy the joke with him. "Extensive experience, so we're going to give the sergeant a chance to show us, because that's fair, isn't it? Everybody gets to show me what extensive means." He turned back to her. "Grab my wrist, go on, however you like. Show me what they taught you wherever it was you came from." I have thought a great deal about what she must have been weighing in that half-second. I know now, from everything that came later, that she could have ended him standing right there. That she had, at that point in her life, controlled larger and more dangerous men than Cade Bishop more times than either of us could count. But she also knew what she was on that post to do, and she knew that a transfer sergeant humiliating a beloved master instructor in front of 40 witnesses on the first Tuesday was not the way to do it. So she did the humble thing. She reached out and took his wrist lightly, the way a student takes a wrist in the first hour of the first day, and she let herself be the prop. Bishop moved. It was a good clean technique, a wrist rotation into an arm drag that put her stumbling forward past his hip, exactly the small defeats large lesson upside down, the master defeating the small, and the room made the sound, and he could have stopped there. He should have stopped there. The point was made. She'd been folded gently, and the lesson was delivered. But she hadn't gone all the way down. That was the thing. He'd expected her to sprawl, to slap the mat, to give him the full theatrical fall the demonstration wanted, and instead she'd taken the arm drag and turned with it, rolled her shoulder through it, and come up light on the balls of her feet a step away, balanced, unbothered, not resisting him and not falling for him either, just quietly declining to sell the fall. It was the smallest thing, a soft, expert refusal. To 99 men in 100, it would have read as nothing at all. But Bishop had spent his whole life reading bodies, and he knew, in the place where he lived, exactly what he had just seen. And what he had seen was that this small woman had absorbed his technique like it was weather and given him nothing, and that if he tried it again at full speed, she would give him nothing again. And Cade Bishop could not have that, not on the first Tuesday, not with the room watching. I saw his face change. I knew that face. I'd seen it turned on other soldiers, on equipment that failed, on me twice. The flat drop of the features when the warmth went out and the other thing came up behind his eyes. And before I understood what he meant to do, his hand came up and he struck her. It was open-handed, a hard, flat slap across the side of her face, the kind of blow that has nothing to do with combatives and everything to do with a man reasserting the top of a hierarchy he felt slipping. The sound of it cracked up into the 40-foot ceiling and came back down. Her head turned with it. A woman's head, snapped sideways by a 200-pound man in front of 40 soldiers, and the sound of the slap hanging in the steel trusses. "That's what happens," Bishop said into the ringing silence, "when you come onto my mats thinking extensive means something." His voice was steady, but I could hear the crack under it, the thing that had made him do it. "You show respect first. Then you show me what you've got." I want to tell you the room erupted. It didn't. That is the part I can't get past. Even now, the room did nothing. 40 of the hardest soldiers in the army sat along those walls and watched a master sergeant slap a woman across the face, and the silence just held because he was Bishop, and Bishop was the top of the room, and every man there had spent years being taught that the top of the room was where the truth lived. The captain with the ranger tab shifted and looked at the mat. Pruitt, the mountain, stared straight ahead. And God help me, I felt the ugly little flicker of agreement, the thought that formed in me clean and fast and without shame. She shouldn't have shown him up. As if the slap were a thing she had caused. As if a woman declining to fall over were an assault on the natural order, and Bishop only the natural order defending itself. That was who I was. I need you to sit in it the way I have had to sit in it, because the whole meaning of what came next is in the distance between the man who felt that flicker and the man telling you this now. She turned her head back to face him, slowly. There was a red bloom already rising along her cheekbone where his hand had landed, and her eyes were wet at the corners the way anyone's eyes water when they're struck across the face, a reflex, not a tear, and she did not touch the mark, and she did not step back, and she did not raise her voice. She looked at Cade Bishop with a stillness that I mistook even then for the stunned quiet of someone who has been put in her place, and she said one thing, and she said it so evenly that it took the whole room a moment to feel the temperature of it. "Show you what I've got," she repeated, not a question, just laying his own words back down on the mat between them. "All right, Master Sergeant, if that's what you want." Bishop should have heard it. If he'd been the soldier I thought he was, he'd have heard the thing that was in those words, the total absence of fear, the flatness of a person who has just decided something, and he would have felt the floor tilt under him. But he was too far up his own certainty to hear anything. He heard a beaten transfer agreeing to be beaten some more. He smiled, and he stepped back, and he opened his hands, and he gave her the mat. "Then let's go," he said. "Full resistance. Show the room what extensive looks like." I have to slow down here, because everything that mattered happened in about 4 minutes. And if I tell it fast, it will sound like the fights men tell each other about over beers, and it was nothing like that. It was quieter than that, and worse than that, and it is the most complete thing I have ever watched one human being do to another. She stepped to the center line and set her feet, and the first thing that changed, the thing I saw and did not understand, was that the apartness went out of her. The small, tired woman against the wall was gone. What stood on the center line now was economical and low and awake, weight dropped, hands loose and forward, chin tucked, and there was no tension in it anywhere, none, the way there's no tension in deep water. Bishop was coiled. She was simply present. And a cold thought went through me, the first honest thought I'd had all morning, and the thought was, I have never seen anyone stand like that. Bishop came in hard. He decided to end it fast now, to erase the small refusal by burying her, and he shot for the same control he'd put on Pruitt, a level change into a body lock that had folded that mountain 3 times. It was the right technique against 99 soldiers in 100. She wasn't there. I don't mean she dodged. Dodging is a thing you see. This was under the level of seeing. She gave a fraction at the hip and turned a few degrees and redirected 200 pounds of driving Master Sergeant past the line where she'd been standing, so that Bishop's own force carried him a half step off his base. And by the time he'd caught himself, she had already flowed to the outside of him, calm as pouring water, one hand light on his shoulder blade, in a position from which every soldier in that room understood it at once, in a single indrawn breath. She could have done anything she wanted. A choke, a throw, a break. She was behind and above him with his back exposed and his balance gone, and she had gotten there in less than a second, off his own attack, without appearing to hurry at all. And she let him go. That was the pattern. That was the whole terrible lesson of the next 4 minutes, and it was 100 times more devastating than any beating could have been. She let him go. She reset him. She stepped back and let Cade Bishop rebuild his base and come at her again, and again she was not where he threw himself, and again she flowed to the place where she owned him, and again, with the room watching, with the red mark still rising on her face, she chose not to finish and let him go. She was not fighting him. I understood it slowly, the way you understand a thing you don't want to. She was teaching him. She was teaching Cade Bishop, in front of the 40 men he needed to be the hardest thing in front of. The exact lesson he had built his life on delivering to others, that size and force and certainty are nothing against real control, and she was teaching it to him at quarter speed, patiently, over and over, refusing each time to let it end, because ending it would have been mercy, and she had decided, somewhere in the ring of that slap, that he had not earned mercy. He had earned the long version. Bishop began to unravel, and the room began to see it. It came off him in layers. The first minute he still believed. He came at her with the sharp, clean aggression that had never once failed him, and each time she folded his attack back into empty air and appeared at his flank and let him go, he told himself it was a fluke, a lucky slip, and he reset harder. By the second minute the belief was gone from his hands. You can see it leave a man. It goes out of the shoulders first, then the feet, and Bishop's feet started to get busy, started to scramble for a base that wasn't there, and a soldier who scrambles has already lost the thing that made him dangerous. By the third minute he was breathing wrong, big ragged pulls, and she had not raised her heart rate at all. I was close enough to see her breathing, and it was slow and even, in through the nose, the breathing of a person doing paperwork. And the whole time she talked to him, quietly, not taunting. That was the thing that took the room apart. She narrated it evenly, the exact way Bishop narrated his own demonstrations, except she was narrating him. "You're reaching," she said, catching a lunge and turning it to nothing. "You reach when you get tired. You teach them not to reach, and then you reach." She let him go. He came again. She stepped off the line, and his own weight took him past her, and she was on his back. There it is again. "You commit your hips before your hands are safe. I could end this here." A beat. She let him go. "I'm not going to yet. I could end this here. I'm not going to yet." She said it 4 times over 4 minutes in that flat, even voice. And each time she said it, the room got colder, because each time it was plainly, demonstrably true. She was behind him, she owned him. The position was there for anyone with eyes, and each time she declined it and reset him and let him spend himself further. Until Cade Bishop, the hardest thing in every room he had ever walked into, was staggering on a clean blue mat in front of 40 silent soldiers, soaked through, chest heaving, being held up by the mercy of a woman half his size who kept explaining, in the gentlest imaginable voice, exactly how completely she owned his life. The men had stopped being an audience. I watched it happen. Somewhere in the second minute, they stopped watching a demonstration and started watching a reckoning, and the faces along the walls changed one by one. The captain with the ranger tab leaning forward now, lips parted. Pruitt the mountain sitting very still with a strange light in his eyes, the light of a big man watching someone do to Bishop what Bishop had done to him. And running under all of it, spreading through the room like cold water finding the low places, the dawning collective understanding that they were not watching an upset. They were watching a category error correct itself. They were watching someone who was simply, plainly, from a different order of skill than the man who had slapped her. And every man in that room who had spent years believing Bishop was feeling the ceiling turn out to be a floor, and something enormous standing on it looking down. I felt it in myself, and I could not stop it. The flicker of agreement I'd had at the slap. She shouldn't have shown him up, curdled and turned and became something I had no name for yet. A hot flood of shame that started in my chest and went out to my hands. Because I finally understood what I was looking at. I finally had, for 4 minutes, the eyes I'd lacked all morning, and with them I looked back at the small woman against the wall reading the room, and I looked at the clean refusal to sell the fall, and I looked at the way she'd stood up without her hands, and I understood that every single sign had been there, and I had read every one of them backward, and that Bishop had read them backward too, and that a man had struck a soldier across the face, for the crime of being better than he had the humility to imagine. She ended it finally on her own terms when she decided the lesson was complete. He came in one last time, slow and gassed and desperate, and she didn't flow away from this one. She met it. She caught the tired lunge and stepped in and took his balance and lowered him. There is no other word. The way you'd lower a heavy thing you didn't want to drop down onto his back on the center line of his own mats, and knelt over him with one knee across his chest and her forearm laid, weightless, without pressure, across his throat. No choke, no force, just the fact of it. The position that says your life is mine and I am choosing to give it back to you. And she held it there for 1 second, 2, 3, so the whole room could photograph it. Cade Bishop flat on his back with a small, older woman's forearm resting on his throat, and his chest heaving under her knee and his eyes wide and empty and finally understanding. Then she took her arm away and stood up off him, clean and unhurried, and stepped back to the center line and stood there, breathing slow, waiting, while Cade Bishop lay on his back on the mats and did not get up. The room did not make the sound. There was no sound at all. 40 of the hardest soldiers in the army sat along the walls in total silence, and the man on the floor was the master, and the woman standing over him had not been given her rank back yet, and none of us knew what came next. That is when the doors at the far end of the schoolhouse opened, and the generals walked in. I need to explain what those doors meant, because to understand the last part you have to understand that the timing was not luck. It felt like luck that morning. It felt like the universe itself had arranged to arrive at the exact moment, but it wasn't. There was a reason Sergeant Vale had transferred onto our post mid-cycle. And there was a reason 4 general officers walked into a combative schoolhouse on a Tuesday. And the reasons were the same reason. And the whole post, except the 2 men on the mats, had apparently known a piece of it. And Bishop and I had known none of it because Bishop never read anything that didn't flatter him, and I read only what Bishop read. There were 4 of them, in the utility uniform, no ceremony, walking the long edge of the mats with a small cluster of staff officers trailing behind. And at the front, a lean gray 2-star I would later learn commanded the whole training and doctrine enterprise for the Army, the man whose signature sat at the bottom of every manual we taught from. They had come to the schoolhouse for a walk-through. That was all. A routine look at the flagship course before a confirmation board finished its business on post that week. And they had walked in through the far doors in time to see the last 30 seconds of it, in time to see a master sergeant flat on his back, and a small unranked sergeant standing over him in the silence of 40 stunned men. The 2-star stopped at the edge of the mats. He took in the room, the frozen soldiers, the man on the floor, the red mark that anyone could now see rising livid on the standing sergeant's face, and his expression did a thing I have never forgotten. It went from mild curiosity to something very cold, very fast, and then it did something stranger. When his eyes reached the small woman standing on the center line, it changed a third time, into something I could only later name as a kind of stunned respect braided through with a rising fury, the fury of a man realizing what he has just walked in on the tail end of. "Sergeant Major," the 2-star said. And I felt the whole room tilt because he had not said sergeant. He had said sergeant major, and he had said it to her. She turned to face him and came to attention, the first formal thing she'd done all morning, and the movement of 40 soldiers understanding at the same instant is a physical thing, a pressure change in a room. Sergeant major, not sergeant. The transfer sergeant with no rank on her chest was a sergeant major, the top enlisted grade in the Army, and she had stood against the back wall and let Cade Bishop call her sergeant and slap her across the face and demand she show him what extensive meant, and she had never once corrected him, because she had stripped her rank off with everyone else's at the door, and on the mats she was just a body, exactly as Bishop always preached, and he had struck her anyway. "Sir," she said. "Somebody," the 2-star said, not loudly, to the room in general, "is going to tell me what I just watched." Nobody moved, and then the captain with the Ranger tab stood up off the wall. I will always respect him for it. He was the first, and came to attention and said in a voice that carried, "Sir, the master sergeant struck her, open hand across the face, before any of this. She wasn't resisting. He struck her to make a point." The 2-star's jaw worked once. He looked down at Bishop, who had gotten himself up onto one elbow now, and was sitting half upright on the mats, gray-faced, his chest still heaving, staring at the row of stars along the edge of his own kingdom with the expression of a man watching his life come apart and not yet able to feel the pieces land. "On your feet, Master Sergeant," the 2-star said. Bishop got up. It took him 2 tries. He came to attention, and I saw his hands trembling at the seams of his trousers, and I understood that some part of him had begun to add it up, the mid-cycle transfer, the word extensive, the way she moved, the general saying sergeant major, and that the total was arriving in him all at once like cold water down the spine. "Do you know who this is?" the 2-star said. Bishop's mouth opened. Nothing came out. "I asked you a question. You've been running this schoolhouse for 6 years. You teach 40 men at a time out of a manual. Do you know," the general said, and now there was iron in it, "who you just put your hand on?" "No, sir," Bishop said. His voice was a wreck. "No, sir, I don't." And the 2-star told him. He told the whole room, and he did not soften it, and it is burned into me word for word. "This is Sergeant Major Ada Vale." He let the name sit. 26 years, 2 combat deployments, you've never been anywhere near the likes of. The Distinguished Service Cross, That's one step below the Medal of Honor, Master Sergeant, in case the manual didn't cover it, for an action I'm not going to describe in front of 40 people because half of it is still classified, except to tell you that she held a compromised position and brought 11 soldiers out of it, and the reason those 11 men have families today is the woman you just slapped across the face to make a point. He took a breath. And that manual you teach from. The modern combatives program, the whole doctrine, the thing your badge means. She wrote it, the core of it, 15 years ago. You have spent 6 years teaching 40 soldiers at a time out of a book that this sergeant major authored, and this week she transferred onto this post because of bored, and here he gestured without turning at the 3 general officers standing silent behind him, is confirming her as the next commandant of this school. Your school. She came in early, quietly, in a training uniform with no rank on it, to see the course the way a student sees it before she takes command of it. The silence in that schoolhouse was the loudest thing I have ever heard. So the answer to my question, the 2-star finished, very quietly now, is that you struck the woman who wrote the doctrine, earned the second highest award this country gives, saved 11 soldiers with her own hands and is about to be your commandant. You struck her across the face, in front of 40 witnesses, to make a point about respect. Bishop made a sound, not a word, a sound. I looked at Sergeant Major Vale through all of this, and here is the thing I have carried longest. She took no pleasure in it. None. A lesser person I would have, at that point in my life, would have stood there and drunk it down, watched the man who slapped her get flayed by a 2-star in front of the room, and enjoyed every second. She didn't. She stood at attention with the red mark on her face and her eyes level, and something almost like sorrow in the set of her mouth, the sorrow of a professional watching another professional destroy himself over a thing that never had to happen. She had beaten him on the mats because he'd forced her to and because he'd earned the lesson, but she took nothing from this part. This part was just the cost of what he'd done, arriving. "Sir," she said. It was the only time she spoke in that whole final stretch, and she said it to interrupt him, gently, which took a nerve I still can't fully imagine interrupting a 2-star mid-reckoning. "Permission to speak." "Granted." "He's a good instructor, sir." She said it flatly, factually, the way she'd narrated everything. 6 years of soldiers left this schoolhouse better than they came in. That's real. That's in the record, and it should stay in the record. She paused. What he did to me today is also real, and it's disqualifying, and I'm not asking you to set it aside. I'm asking you to put both true things in the file. He earned both of them. A man's record should be honest. I have thought about that more than I've thought about the fight. She had every reason to want him erased, and instead she stood there with his handprint on her face and argued that his file should be honest, that the good he'd done should be recorded alongside the thing that ended him. It was the most complete demonstration of the difference between them that the whole morning produced, and it did more to dismantle the man I used to be than the 4 minutes on the mats had done. Anyone can win a fight. I had watched the finest close-quarters soldier in the army win a fight, but then I watched her decline to gloat over the wreckage of the man who'd humiliated her, and insist on his dignity in the same breath she confirmed his ruin, and I understood that the thing I'd spent 11 months admiring in Bishop, the hardness, the top-of-the-room certainty, was a cheap imitation of a thing I was only now, at that moment, seeing for real. Real hardness didn't need to slap anybody. Real hardness could put its forearm on your throat and give your life back and then argue for your good name. It didn't have anything to prove because it had nothing to defend. The 2-star looked at her for a long moment, and something in his face eased, and he nodded once. "Noted, Sergeant Major. It'll be an honest file." Then he turned back to Bishop, and the ease went out of him again. "But you're done here. You're relieved, effective now. There'll be a formal process, and you'll have your say in it, and this Sergeant Major just bought you a fairer hearing than you've earned. But you will not teach another class on these mats. Turn in your access." "Master Sergeant Prewitt." The mountain came off the wall fast. "Walk him to the office and stay with him." Bishop didn't argue. There was nothing left in him to argue with. He looked once at Sergeant Major Vale, one look, and I couldn't read all of what was in it, but part of it, I swear, was the beginning of understanding. the first crack of a man realizing the size of the thing he'd struck. And then he dropped his eyes and walked off his own mats for the last time, past 40 silent soldiers, with a 260-pound armor sergeant beside him, and the doors at the far end swallowed him. The generals didn't stay long after that. The two-star spoke quietly with Sergeant Major Vale for a minute. I couldn't hear it, but I saw her nod, and saw him put out his hand and saw her take it. And then the four of them and their staff filed back out the way they'd come, and the doors closed, and 40 senior non-commissioned officers and one ranger captain and one shaken corporal were left standing in the enormous quiet of the schoolhouse with the woman who was about to become our commandant. She let the quiet sit for a moment. Then she walked to the center line unhurried and stood where she'd stood at the start and looked around at all of us, at the mark on her own face that nobody could stop looking at, and she said, in that same even voice, "We've got a level 4 cycle to run. Sit down. We'll start with where the body's balance actually lives, because from what I saw this morning, most of you are carrying yours too high." And 40 men who had watched all of it sat down along the walls like recruits, and I sat down with them, and Sergeant Major Ada Vale began, quietly, to teach. She never once mentioned the fight again. Not that day, not in the 3 weeks that followed, not in the 2 years I served under her after she took command. She taught the cycle out that Tuesday as though nothing had happened, and she was, I say this as a man who thought Cade Bishop was the ceiling, the finest teacher I have ever stood in a room with, because everything she showed you gently, and everything she corrected without ever once needing you to feel small so that she could feel large. The thing Bishop had needed from every room, she did not need from any room. She'd already been to the bottom of what she could do, alone, in a compromised position with 11 men's lives in her hands, and she had nothing left to prove to a schoolhouse full of sergeants. And so she could afford to be kind. That was the lesson under the lesson, and it took me months to fully learn it. I found her in the equipment cage a week later, alone, laying out crash pads before the morning cycle, and I did the hardest thing I had done in my adult life, which was to stand in front of her and tell the truth. "Sergeant Major," I said, "the morning he hit you, I need you to know I agreed with him. In my head. When it happened, I thought you'd brought it on yourself by not falling down. That's the man I was. I've been sick over it for a week and I didn't want to carry it without saying it to your face." She stopped laying out the pads and looked at me for a while. She didn't make it easy and she didn't make it hard. She just looked at me with those level eyes and then she said, "How old are you, Corporal?" 23, Sergeant Major." "You had a bad teacher who was good at teaching," she said. "That's the most dangerous kind because he made the wrong thing feel like strength and you were young enough to buy it. The fact that you're standing here telling me this means you're already most of the way out of it." She went back to the pads. "Don't do penance. Do better. And when you've got your own room someday, remember which one of us you want to have been." That was all. She never brought it up again either. I got my own room, eventually. I run a combatives program at a post I won't name, and there is a big man in every cycle, and there is always a moment where the cheap thing is available to me. The moment where I could make the room believe by making one person small, the way Bishop made rooms believe for 6 years. I know that moment intimately now. I feel it come up in me, and I know exactly what it is, because I felt its cheapest possible version rise in my own chest at the sound of a slap, when I was 23 and too proud to have the eyes to see what was standing in front of me. I don't take it. I think about a small woman standing on a center line with a handprint on her face, declining 4 times to end a man she could have ended in a second, and then arguing that his file should be honest. And I put my hand on the biggest soldier's shoulder, and I teach him gently, and the room believes anyway. They called her sergeant and slapped her across the face to make a point about respect. Minutes later, 4 generals ended the man who did it, and the truth the whole schoolhouse learned that Tuesday, the truth I have spent a career trying to be worthy of, is that the strongest person in any room is almost never the one who needs you to know it.